Leo, I've been with the foundation about 10 years, or about 11 years now. And what I'm going to do is introduce Mr. Walter Brooks, who is a former board member and now on the advisory board with the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation and author. And I'll let him speak more for himself and the work that he's done in Omaha. So over to you, Walter.
Oh, thank you, Leo. And hello to all of you.
I don't know if we can hear you very well.
Can you can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Is he audible, folks? You're not very audible. Do you have a headphone plugged in or something?
Leo, can you hear him? Can you hear me?
No.
Uh-oh, your audio went down. Do you have your hand over the microphone? We had great audio before.
Okay, what about now?
No, he's still low. Did it connect to some type of device, Bluetooth or anything on?
No, but I'm gonna give him a Bluetooth here in a second.
All right. What happened to the picture? I'm asking.
Still can't hear you. You're very low.
Okay.
Yeah, we lost the audio. I don't know how we lost the audio.
Okay, well, I can hear you.
Yep, you can hear us. We cannot hear you. You're very, very, very low. And while I was speaking, or prior to me speaking, we could hear him loud and clear, but suddenly it went away. I don't know what happened in between that time.
Leo, if you can hear me at all, would you just continue with some conversation until we get this worked out?
Yeah, we can hear you. We definitely can hear you. But it's just not loud enough. I can hear you barely. And I think that goes the same for the rest of the audience.
Find some headphones, Walter or Sherry. Find some headphones if you have that option.
My phone is attached to a charger, and the charger is where the headphones are attached to.
Okay, don't worry about it.
So I'm gonna figure it out just because I am.
All right. Well, in the meantime, while we wait on that technical issue to get fixed, if you have an opportunity, make sure that you get a copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X. I'm not getting paid for this. I don't get endorsement for selling copies of the autobiography, but it's always a good read. And when you get the information out of this book, you have to read it a couple times. I read it once and then I had to go back and read it when I came into more knowledge of Malcolm, more understanding of what his principles were, and things stood out to me that didn't stand out to me before. And that's kind of why we're having this conversation. There are a lot of people who watched the movie Malcolm X, but really haven't read the autobiography through and through, page for page. And when you read the autobiography, you get a whole different perspective of Malcolm, especially his epiphanies as he traveled abroad and started to understand how the world was really shaping around racism and what it looked like on a global scale. Also, if you get a chance to read this book has some very interesting information. This is by Manning Marable. It's The Reinvention of X. This came out some years ago. So if you get a chance to check out The Reinvention of X, definitely it's a detailed read on Malcolm. We also have a new text that was recently put out. It's called The Dead Are Rising. This is by Les Payne. So a lot of the things we'll talk about today, well, some of the things we'll talk about today have come from this text. Very interesting information in this particular book discussing Malcolm and his life. There's a number of books, and on my bookshelf, I know I have a lot of books about Malcolm. I can't reach them all, but I got a lot of information back there. And we'll talk a little bit about Malcolm, his life again, like I said, from the context of what Malcolm would have wanted people to know. And if you get a chance to read Ilyasha's first book, his daughter's book, make sure you check that out, Growing Up X, where she talks about growing up the daughter of Malcolm X and what it meant for her. She recently published a new book as well. I don't own that one yet, so I can't show you, and I don't remember the title of it. But there's so many books written on Malcolm. If you come up to the Malcolm X Center, you'll see that we have at least 40 books that have been written on Malcolm by different authors, basically taking different perspectives. Some redo his life, some go over speeches that Malcolm has done before, and some talk about specific parts of Malcolm's life. So if you get a chance to check those things out, I really encourage you to do so. Meanwhile, we know Walter's still doing his thing, but we'll get right into some of the discussion about Malcolm and what we were going to talk about today. And when he comes back on, we'll add his perspective. And Walter is writing a book right now, and I'll let him tell you more about that when he gets here. But the book goes into what can we do since the passing of Malcolm X. Walter spent over 40 years curating knowledge and putting together a master text of what race and class looks like in America and what it looks like going forward. And so we really look forward to getting him back on this Zoom call and having some dialogue about what he has discovered, what he has uncovered, and what he has researched throughout this time. Let's see, who do we have popping in here? All right. So, quick introduction about how I ended up at the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation. Hey, you there? Walter?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Still low. You're still low.
Oh, man. I'm so sorry, Leo. Just keep talking, trying to figure this out. Please explain if you can hear me at all.
We can barely hear you. Like, it's very, very faint. It's barely audible. So we'll get into how I ended up at the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation for those who probably don't know. I got it. I don't like doing Zoom calls. But how I ended up with the foundation is some years ago, me and a group of friends, we started a organization called Found Period. We didn't know it would be an organization. It was just a group of brothers trying to figure out how to leave street life and how to better ourselves, really. When we sat in a room and started having conversations as young Black males in our early 20s, we realized that our stories were very similar. We were growing up in single parent households. We were growing up in conditions that we didn't feel were favorable to our thriving. We felt that our education was poor, and we gravitated towards the streets to find ourselves and find our identities. So we would have these meetings every single Sunday. Now, having these meetings every Sunday, we would bring in text. One of my friends, he brought in the Quran. At the time, I was practicing Christianity, so I brought in the Bible, and we would compare notes on what it looked like to be wise and what it meant to just be men in society. So as we compared the notes using these spiritual religious texts, we started to find similarities. We also started to find differences. And we also reached out to other teachers to come to our meetings and have conversations with us. One of the members had invited an individual from the United Nation of Islam, which was a offshoot of the Nation of Islam. And this one was based out of Kansas City. And they came in and started having conversations with us about producing their own food, having their own stores. And if you want to know more about our story, there was an article published this very same day, 2015, by the Omaha World Herald about our group. So if you do an old Google search, you can find our group, because one of the writers wanted to commemorate Malcolm on the 21st of February in 2015 and came to the Malcolm X Center where we were hosting our meetings. Now, we originally weren't hosting our meetings at the Malcolm X Center. We were hosting them in different areas of the town, some at the OIC, some at the OSBN, which is now empty, vacant. And then we eventually made a relationship with the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation. I got into community gardening based on the United Nations of Islam's suggestion that we should learn how to grow our own food. So I got into community gardening, and the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation needed a community garden. So I helped them build their first community garden back in 2011. Now, or 2010, I'm sorry. So we started that garden, and at that same time, the foundation was acquiring its first building. They were going to buy it from the Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall. Now, if you've ever been to the Malcolm X Foundation, you'll notice the address is 3448, and it's on the left side of the street. That is odd because on the left side of the street, typically when you're heading west, those numbers are odd numbers, not even numbers. The Malcolm X Foundation changed the address from 3463 Evans to 3448 Evans to mimic more of Malcolm X's original address. Now, Malcolm was born at 3448 Pinckney Street. So being born at 3448 Pinckney Street, the foundation thought it would be cool to have the building 3448 Evans. Now, when they were attempting to acquire this building, I had just started to find my niche as community organizer. And so I decided to offer my services to the foundation on a volunteer basis to assist in raising funds to get this building. So we came up with this grand idea, which was the Guinness Book of World Records for the most t-shirts folded simultaneously. I know it sounds weird, but we could beat that record. It was only 125 t-shirts folded at the same time ever before. So we figured we can get more than 125 people to get t-shirts and fold them up simultaneously, and then we'll beat the record. Well, we only ended up with about 75 people, but the World Herald still published the article anyway. And that's where I found my niche in organizing and reaching out and getting people involved and engaged in activities. After doing so, the foundation ended up taking out a small loan from an investor who helped them acquire the building. So we were still able to get the building. Once they acquired the building, the meetings that I would have with my guys on Sundays, we eventually moved into the Malcolm X building, would have those meetings at the Malcolm X Foundation every Sunday, under the condition that we would help fundraise, bring awareness to the organization, and host events at the building, which I began to do, and other members of the organization began to do as well. So over time, we started gaining traction, we started gaining momentum. And there were times where our meetings got up to about 60 to 70 people on a Sunday afternoon of just regular everyday people who were attempting to change their lives and figure out what they could do to better themselves. We'd have these great conversations in a circle, and it was really spiritual. It was just really something that helped me grow and helped a lot of people grow. And there's a lot of great things that go on in the community because of the things that we did. So since about 2010 and moving forward, we continued to meet at the Malcolm X Foundation up until about 2016, which we disbanded those meetings, but I continued to volunteer with the organization all the way through and through. And in about 2000, I guess this was 2018 now, and with the pandemic, it seems like a whole year just disappeared. But in 2018, I was doing community organizing for the community garden that we have at the Malcolm X Foundation, and our previous board president was working at OPS. Well, we decided that we wanted to take on the issue of dealing with student discipline, and that became a real political battle, to the extent in which our previous board president lost his position in the Omaha public school system over it. And so he went unemployed for about 6 months and found employment in Portland, Oregon, and he needed to retire from the board, which he had been with the board for a very long time. At the same time, we lost about 4 other board members, and partially that was due to people like Walter transitioning in life and moving out of Omaha, and some of the other elders retiring from the board as well, considering that it was their time to retire on their own personal decision. There was no internal problems with the organization. So that left myself and a couple of other board members left, and I was nominated as the board president. So since 2019, I've been the board president with the Malcolm X Foundation ever since. So that's just a brief history of how I ended up with the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation and what it means for me to be there. Now, I'm sorry about this Zoom call. I don't like Zoom because you can't be as as active as you want to be when you're doing a presentation. So just bear with me as y'all continue to watch this. I'll try to share some information that hopefully will enlighten you. So we'll get right into Malcolm X and his Omaha roots, and I'll tell you a little bit about Malcolm and his Omaha roots based on some information that we've researched in the organization and that we've been able to pull in. Okay, we see we got Walter back. Let's see what that works. All right, we're bringing you in, Mr. Brooks. Just a moment, you guys. I'm going to get right back into presentation once I see if he's okay. Okay, Walter, we see you're in here.
See if we can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes. Yeah, you got audible claps. You got claps from the people.
Let's have a round of applause for Sherry. She figured it out. I don't know what she did. I had my eyes closed the whole time. All right.
Okay,
Okay.
good. Well, you caught me before I started getting into some history, and
Oh, I was listening.
okay.
All right. Now, my name is Walter Vincent Brooks. I will be 74 years old and this time next month. And I do go back a ways. I am a former 10-year member of the board at the Malcolm X Foundation. And since my wife and I relocated to North Carolina in 2019, I remain a lifelong member of the advisory board. My history is pretty, it's all over the map, but there has been a continual focus and thrust of trying to participate in the development of the Black community, trying to participate in a number of efforts as a part of the struggle, as we call it. And as Leo mentioned, I am about to self-publish my first book. The title of my book is Trust, No Shadows After Dark, subtitled African American Genocide in the United States of America. I have a simple premise that certainly the 400 years that the African American people have been in North America, it has been a nonstop struggle against dehumanization, slavery, and everything in between. And in my book, what I'm doing is I'm essentially saying, and I'm actually really focusing intensely on what has happened in the last 50 to 60 years. But in order to do that, I've had to show a fairly substantial arc of our history in this country, from enslavement to the next 100 years. As I describe it, we were enslaved human beings for 250 years. And then to quote the historian Douglas A. Blackman, we were slavery by another name for almost the next 100 years. In fact, his book is called Slavery by Another Name, subtitled The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from 1865 to World War II. So that basically takes us another 90 years. And then, of course, the post-World War II existence for African Americans has been a constant battle for our civil rights, and then progressively for a much broader perspective of who we are as African American people. And that brings us to none other than the man of the hour and the day, Malcolm X, who, among other things, was laying a platform for the African American people to see our existence in America as something far more substantial than simply pursuing our civil rights, our legal rights as American citizens. Malcolm was one of the most important African American leaders, really since Marcus Garvey in the 1920s, who was really the first major, not simply Black leader in the United States, but a world leader to really show Black people that we are not a minority. We in America, the African American people, we have been told for 400 years that we are a minority. And Malcolm was the latest generation to say, no, we're not. We are a race of people that must consider ourselves part of the global population, which is essentially 90+% non-white, and to stop thinking of ourselves as minority. And even that very nomenclature, as we have seen in our present time in 2021, is archaic and anarchaic. First of all, in the census of 2000, California, with 40 million people, became the first majority non-white state of the 50 states. And in my research that I have incorporated into my book, the census indication is that the entire white race of the United States will become a minority in the next 25 years. And that has created a number of very troubling and potentially catastrophic conflicts for the future. I think that those of us that watched hours of television, as I did, I'm sure as Leo did, watching the swarming of the Capitol, the citadel of elected power in America, being run over and trampled, clearly the voting for our future in this country, if that didn't make people start to go, where is all of this heading? That we had the first African American president, Barack Obama, for 8 years, which was followed by this horrific explosion and retrenchment of white supremacy, xenophobia, hatred of foreigners, homophobia, Islamophobia. We saw in 4 years of Donald Trump a culmination that happened with the swarming of the nation's capital. And so I have titled my book African American Genocide because I'm essentially saying I have made a major study of the arc and progression of events in this country. And I am very hard pressed, both as an intellectual and a community activist, to wonder how things are going to be resolved in America without a catastrophic conflict of bloodshed. And we clearly can see that what has happened just in the last few months, there has been a certification and a verification that at least 75 million Americans, who are predominantly Caucasian, although the Trump side of the equation has Black people and Latino people and so forth, but this is a white people's movement, a white supremacist thinking people's movement that has clearly established for the first time since the Civil War of 1860 to 1865 that there are two fundamental power positions in America. Now, the Confederacy went to war. That is the only thing that essentially is left to do with what's taking place right now. Certainly in the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a significant progression of violence against Black people. I am not leaving anyone out. There's violence against the LGBTQ community, against Jews, certainly against Asians. Within the last couple of weeks, I've been fairly shocked at how many violent attacks are being made on Asian Americans, and this is relating to predominantly to COVID and so forth. What I wanted to do is participating in this program today, in addition to reading some excerpts, and I asked Leo in advance if that would be okay. This isn't about me hyping or promoting my my book as much as a conversation about Malcolm X is filtered all the way through my book from beginning to end, and not necessarily mentioning his name. The things that Malcolm laid down, the tracks that he left, if I can use that term, the tracks that he left for us are actually quite substantial and extremely predictive of what we have been going through, certainly in the last 10 to 15 years as African American people, and what we, in my estimation, are going to have to go through before things get straightened out and true human rights prevail in the United States of America. So if Leo wanted to add anything, I have a short statement that I was going to open with, and then though I've been talking for a few minutes, I actually had a little written statement that I wanted to open with, and then I'm going to throw it back to Leo because we've got a number of questions and a little bit of an agenda that he's going to guide us through, and I will continue to offer reflections. A lot of what you're going to hear from me about Malcolm X specifically has to do with the legacy he left us in the creation of an organization that he left for the African American people and for the struggle for true freedom in America, called the Organization of Afro-American Unity. I have studied this layout because that's what he did. He laid it out after he made his historic trip to Mecca in Africa and the Arab countries, and really certified himself as not just an African-American national leader, but Malcolm X was as much of a global leader as Nelson Mandela or anybody else that you can think of on the national, international front. So unless you wanted to jump in here, Leo, I could go ahead.
Yeah, did you read your statement?
Yeah, did you want me to do that?
Yeah, go ahead, and then we'll get into some history.
Okay. Okay, talking points for conversation on the life and legacy of Malcolm X. On June 28, 1964, after Malcolm X returned from his historic international journey that included the Holy Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca, followed by visitations to 5 Arab countries and a dozen Black African countries, all of where he was accorded the honors as a head of state, he delivered his long-anticipated introduction of the new organization he created to answer the needs of the African-American struggle for freedom. The new organization Malcolm introduced was called the Organization of Afro-American Unity, the OAAU. Today, with 56 more years of white supremacy and racism pushing back against the aspirations of the African-American people to finally be accorded the full rights of citizenship and protections as American citizens, and a new, increasingly violent social atmosphere led by President Donald Trump that is clearly presenting a national security military threat to not only the American government, but to the safety and future of the African American population. It is time to go back to the OAAU and review exactly what it was that Malcolm X had created and planned to do. Before I review the fundamental components of Malcolm X's vision for a united Black-led movement in the United States, I want to start by reminding our audience of what I have always considered the very essence of Malcolm X's political thinking. About a year before Malcolm X brought forth his revolutionary new organizational system, he spoke to a group of young preteen and teenage Black children from Macomb, Mississippi. The group of 37 Black kids were all veteran civil rights activists. They each had felt that they needed to play a more direct, active role in the struggle for Black freedom after the Birmingham, Alabama bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church on September 15, 1963, that killed 4 little Black girls attending Sunday school. These Macomb, Mississippi school children started advocating against segregated schools, segregated swimming pools, and the racist treatment of their community. Eventually, they initiated a movement to boycott their racist school system. This had led to all of them being permanently expelled from the school system, repeated attacks and assaults by racist police officers, and all of the kids had been arrested and placed in jail, many more than once. All right. Well, all right, I'm trying to get this back together. Okay, here we go. Okay. Somebody called and said, I can't see my face, so I'm trying to work that out now. Okay. After enduring months of traumatic conflict in their fight for justice, many of these kids were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental disturbances. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the major youth wing of the entire civil rights movement, along with the Black community of Macomb, Mississippi, felt that these kids needed to be sent away for some rest and relaxation and just the ability to remember that they were still children. So the community, churches, street people, everybody chipped in and got 37 of them a round trip vacation to New York City. In New York City, they all did all the fun tourist stuff, visited the Empire State Building, the Apollo Theater, the Statue of Liberty, all the sights and sounds of Harlem, USA. But the highlight of their trip, and most probably the highlight of their entire lives, was a personal audience with Malcolm X at his new headquarters in the Audubon Ballroom building. What Malcolm X said to these kids became immortalized in his speech titled, Malcolm X Speaks to Young People. On December 31st, 1964, about 6 weeks before he was assassinated, his opening words to these Black kids, in my estimation, was his advisory for the entire African American people for the next 100 years. And I will add his advisory for every American, white, Black, Asian, Latino, gay, straight, you name it. This is what Malcolm X said, the first words out of his mouth to those children. One of the first things that I think young people, especially nowadays, should learn is how to see for yourself and listen for yourself and think for yourself. then you can come to an intelligent decision for yourself. If you form the habit of going by what you hear others say about someone, or going by what others think about someone, instead of searching that thing out for yourself and seeing for yourself, you will be walking west when you think you're walking east, and you will be walking east when you think you're going west. This generation, especially of our people, has a burden more so than any other time in history. The most important thing that we can learn today is to think for ourselves. Unquote. This is why we are all here today. Not just to remember Malcolm X on the 57th anniversary of his assassination, but to remember his works, his words, and his mind, and to see, looking through eyes that are now almost 3 generations past the life of Malcolm X, what is it about this man? What is it about his ideas? What is it about what is happening to Black people in America, especially in the last 4 years, that makes Malcolm X more relevant today than he was in 1964? What did Malcolm X see in 1964 that we are just now waking up to today? As part of today's conversation, I intend to support much of my own comments and or Leo Lewis's comments with excerpts from the research I have done in my upcoming book, Trust No Shadows After Dark, African-American Genocide in the United States of America. I honestly believe in my heart that Malcolm X would be proud of the work I'm about to publish. You can feel the spirit of Malcolm X on almost every page. Malcolm X has spoken to me from the ancestors for the last 50 years. I think I have learned my lessons well, and I hope you will too. Okay, Leo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. Always eloquent. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to give some context of the conditions that Malcolm X was born in, and really give a blueprint or an overview of what Omaha looked like in the early 1900s. So a good bit of this information that we're going to share is from this book, The Dead Are Rising. It's a little more detailed context of what Malcolm experienced here in Omaha, Nebraska. So Malcolm's father is Earl Little. His mother is Louise Little. And they traveled around spreading the teachings of Marcus Garvey. For those who don't know who Marcus Garvey is, he created one of the largest Black-only organizations in the entire history of mankind. His organization had over 1 million followers, and this is at a time where there was no Twitter, no Facebook, no YouTube, no Instagram, and he was still able to circle the globe. And he started an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And that organization specifically was charged with unifying Blacks all across the globe, regardless of where they were. And Marcus Garvey, a little known fact is that there was actually a guy named, let's see if I can find that name that I noted earlier. There's actually a young man who is charged with being the predecessor to Marcus Garvey. His name is Edward Wilmot Blyden. Edward Wilmot Blyden, who moved to Liberia in 1851, is quoted with being the first person to really talk about Pan-Africanism. So Pan-Africanism and Black nationalism is the ideology that Blacks need their own republic, need their own state, their own place to be as a people. And Edward Blyden specifically believed in this, and he made a number of publishings. Marcus Garvey happened to had read some of these publishings and took it a step further and created the organization. Now, his organization in the early 1900s spoke about Black pride and for Black people to hold their heads up high, lift themselves up by their bootstraps, and not be oppressed, no matter where they were on the globe, especially in America. Now, Marcus Garvey was from Jamaica. He wasn't from America. But when he got to America, he began to rally individuals who he felt were oppressed and needed some uplifting. And they would join his organization. He would give them a membership card. They would get a uniform. He started a group of nurses who would go in the community and provide free services to people in the community. And Marcus Garvey continued to organize through his great skill of being an orator. Now, he wasn't always the best orator, but he eventually became a really good orator and speaker. So Marcus Garvey would recruit individuals who ran churches, a lot of pastors and preachers, to join his movement, especially a lot of Black churches. And one of those pastors that he recruited was Earl Little. Earl Little and his wife Louise Little traveled recruiting members for the UNIA, Marcus Garvey's organization. Individuals who associated with Marcus Garvey were called Garveyites. And so Earl Little and Louise Little, off of the suggestion of Earl's older brothers, Oscar and James, came to Omaha, Nebraska because he heard there were jobs here. So he came to Omaha, Nebraska. He came to Omaha, Nebraska and started working at the Livestock Exchange building, which we all know, if you're from Omaha, is in South Omaha. It's now an apartment building, but it used to be the slaughterhouse for a lot of cows, and it was the meatpacking plant. So Earl Little started working there in the early 1920s. And this is about 1920, 1921 when he got to Omaha. Now, what's really interesting is just 2 years prior to Earl Little getting here, there was the assassination of Will Brown in 1919. Now, Will Brown was lynched downtown at the courthouse because he was accused of rape. Though he did not commit that rape, a mob still sought to lynch him. And there's this very famous picture of a body being burned and tortured, and that was Will Brown. And that's a whole nother story. We'll get into that later, but just understand that shortly after that, according to this particular text, in 1921, on 41st and Farnham. So if you're from Omaha, you can just go to 41st and Farnham and just imagine this. On 41st and Farnham, there was the first KKK unit in Omaha, Nebraska. It was created in 1921. That was their first office. Now, by the mid-1920s, the Ku Klux Klan in the state of Nebraska had recruited over 45,000 members, according to the Nebraska State Historical Society. So Earl Little in the 1920s and Louise Little in the 1920s were facing a great deal of oppression and racism here in Omaha, Nebraska, while still attempting to uplift Black people through oratory, speeches, and teaching Black people how to self-sustain. So we had this going on in the climate of Omaha, Nebraska in the 1920s. So Earl, after working at the packing plant, was actually eventually fired because the workers there learned about his work of preaching the Garveyist ideology. And eventually he spent his time taking offerings from his church and doing some carpentry work. He eventually purchased a plot of land in rural Omaha, which today is known as 3448 Pinckney Street, which is the birthplace of Malcolm X. And it's also the land currently owned by the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation today and surrounded by over 18 acres of land that we have. So just another little piece of history about Earl Little and his work in Omaha is that he used to preach and he tried to recruit members at a building called Liberty Hall on 25th and Lake. The actual address was 2528 Lake Street. And Earl Little used that place to recruit members for the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And again, a lot of that information is in this book, The Dead Are Rising by Les Payne. So if you want more information on that, make sure you go read it. But the reason we have that documentation is because Earl Little's wife, Louise Little, who was a powerhouse in herself, wrote for Marcus Garvey's paper called The Negro World. The Negro World was one of the largest Black-owned newspapers in the entire world. And it was spread all across the globe, informing Black people about different conditions and different situations globally. And Louise Little would document the work of Earl Little and their experiences as they traveled. So before I continue, Mr. Brooks, do you have any context that you'd like to share? You're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep, got you.
Okay. One of the things about Omaha in particular is the almost suffocating degree of segregation. At the time that Earl Little would have been here with his family and Malcolm X as a child, something like the entire Black population of Omaha was stuffed into about 3 census tracts. About 3. That's unbelievable. That's an unbelievable degree of concentration. They literally had the entire Black community confined to a handful of square blocks in North Omaha, and it was virtually impossible to get out. I lived at 25th and Evans Street in North Omaha for almost 28 years, and the owner of the household that I stayed at for those years, she and her husband, she's African American, they were the first in that area. I mean, when you think of a literally all Black community, which you know, a lot of North Omaha certainly was when I moved there in 1977, and to think that once upon a time, where I was living at 25th and Evans was white people for as far as the eye could see. It really says a lot about the change in how many communities. When we look at all these Black ghettos today, it's hard for us to remember that most of them, they didn't start out as the enclave for Black people. They were white communities that changed over. And Earl Little was beyond revolutionary to have come into that kind of community with the ideas of Marcus Garvey, with the idea that Black is beautiful, with the idea that you don't have to be a sharecropper all your life or work in a meatpacking plant all your life, but we can build and so forth. You talk about a man walking into a lion's den. That's basically what I'm saying. Earl Little coming to Omaha, Nebraska was Daniel in the lion's den. Go ahead, Leo.
Thank you. And that's exactly the climate that he walked into. So Earl Little was a very tall man, and he was considered brave by his children and by those who knew him, because he would go into those climates unafraid to speak the teachings of Marcus Garvey at a time which was very unpopular, and it completely juxtaposed the Ku Klux Klan, and they were rivaled by the Ku Klux Klan almost everywhere they went. As a matter of fact, later in life, Malcolm's older brother, Malcolm's older brother, Wilfred, he made a statement, and I'll read you this statement that his older brother Wilfred made. He said, "Our attitude made a difference in how they dealt with us compared to some of the other Negroes," said Wilfred, and this was during an interview. "When white people find out that you don't have that inferiority complex, they deal with you at that level. It makes a difference. A lot of our problems we brought on ourselves by our own inferiority feelings sometimes. If you acted like you were inferior, that's the way they related to you. If you didn't act like you were inferior, then they would be forced to treat you as an equal. And this is the way we were." And that was Wilfred describing the household culture that Earl Little and Louise Little had as they traveled about, and how they would really instill this in their children to have some sense of pride about themselves, knowing that they could change their condition simply just by having that pride. And that was the foundation that Malcolm X was born in and around. Now, another little bit of information that people might not know is here in Omaha, Malcolm had an older sister. Her name was Hilda. She was born October 22nd, 1921. So she was born in Omaha. He also had an older brother, Filbert, who was born in Omaha. So Malcolm was the third child of Earl and Louise Little, born in Omaha, Nebraska. So when you think about Malcolm X and you think about Malcolm being born in Omaha, he had two siblings who were also born here as well. Now, people often ask us at the Malcolm X Foundation, when did Malcolm leave Omaha? Well, according to Les Payne's book, in December of 1926, Earl and Louise Little booked a train to Milwaukee. So that's about the time that we have record that the family left Omaha. So Malcolm would have been about 1.5 years old, heading to 2 years old. So the next thing we wanted to address on the list of things that we are addressing today is, what was Malcolm's views on race? And Mr. Brooks, I'll give you an opportunity if you want to address that first.
Well, of course, with his seminal coming of age, being with the Nation of Islam, and in all the years that I would give tours, that was really one of the first two questions. Did Malcolm X hate white people? No.
Exactly.
Not at all. Malcolm X hated racism. And we still struggle with that today. When we look at all these issues and books and so forth. Malcolm X, I have yet to ever read a single word that came out of Malcolm X's mouth where he said he hated white people. No, he hated racism. He was brutal in his assaults against white supremacy and racism, 1 and 2, and a close third, hypocrisy. So as Malcolm X would say, both the Democrats and the Republicans have sold out Black people. Malcolm was not that person ever who was going to allow himself to be aligned with, let's say, this liberal white faction versus, George Wallace and arch segregationists. He was always very clear in results, and he would be brutal in his attack against people that many of us might have considered liberal white people, because Malcolm was about the results, not the good feelings and so forth. And like I said, I'll be 74, and anybody that's Black has lived long enough has found that you cannot just go through life thinking essentially because somebody likes you, there is no racism within them, that there are not issues and situations and conflicts in which their loyalty to the white race will supersede literally their friendship. And for those of you that may be very familiar with Omaha, I worked at Mutual of Omaha in corporate communications in the 80s. In the 90s, I worked at ConAgra, and from 99 to 2000, almost 2008, I worked at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. I have seen a lot of corporate America, as well as poverty and so forth. And I have told people, I'm a Vietnam veteran, by the way. I'm a Marine Corps Vietnam veteran. I've told people many times, I found corporate warfare psychologically as deadly as anything. Racism in the corporate world will kill you almost like a bullet. So Malcolm was very aware, and when he created the Organization of Afro-American Unity, because back at that time we were transitioning from referring to ourselves as Negroes and generally Blacks to really coming back to our African roots. So that's why I'll be saying Afro, although hardly anybody says that now, but that's Malcolm X's terminology from his time. He really was trying to get Black people to understand that in virtually every issue that we face, and it certainly is clear in the manifesto of the Organization of Afro-American Unity that he left, we have to be about doing these things ourselves. He didn't say, no, we don't want to have nothing to do with white folks. that the OAAU was actually designed to be a national umbrella association of American citizens who were interested fundamentally in human rights, not just civil rights. Can blacks live where they want to live, and can blacks vote, and not be told black people can't come and shop here and all that. That's civil rights. Malcolm was about, no, this organization is going to take this out of America. And if white people want to join with us to take the condition of the African American people to the United Nations, then we're with them. We will work with them. But his critique was, in too many situations in his lifetime, and I certainly have seen it in mine, when you coalesce with certain kinds of people, what happens is, in the end, the African American agenda didn't get done. It got kicked to the back of the bus, and everybody else moved ahead. And Malcolm was very, very critical of that. So he said the organization of Afro-American Unity, the executive leadership would be black people. He said, because that is the only way we can guarantee that this organization, no matter who we work with, who we coalesce with, who we unite with, who we join with, our fundamental issues are not going to get short shrifted. So,
Right on.
that's Malcolm on white folks.
Right on. So we're going to take a couple questions, but before we get into that, I just want to make a comment about the movie One Night in Miami. So if you have not seen the movie One Night in Miami, it is an awesome, awesome screenplay, an awesome movie. It's awesome dialogue that talks about the conversation between Malcolm X, Sam Cooke, Jim Brown, and Muhammad Ali, at that time, Cassius Clay, right in the transition of Cassius Clay converting to Islam and making his stance as Muhammad Ali. One of the things that kind of gets overlooked historically, that many people who might be listening to this might not know, is that Cassius Clay took a liking to Malcolm X. He was a very young man. He took a liking to Malcolm X. And whenever Malcolm was speaking in a place where Cassius Clay was near, Cassius Clay would show up. Now, this information is information you might have missed if you read the autobiography. You got to go back to the original autobiography of Malcolm X. And what you'll find is that when Cassius Clay was going to fight Sonny Liston, which is where the movie is based off of, him fighting Sonny Liston and then them going to the hotel, the Hampton House. Actually, Cassius Clay paid for the trip for Malcolm to come down to Florida while the camp was training. And he actually paid for Malcolm, Betty, and the three girls at the time. So Malcolm, Betty, and the three girls stayed at the Hampton House for a few days with Cassius Clay in his camp, while Cassius looked to Malcolm for advice and for spiritual guidance prior to the fight. Malcolm then took a trip to take Betty back home to New York, flew back down to Miami, and that's when the fight happened, and that's when the night took place, was when Malcolm came back. Now, even in his autobiography, Malcolm talks about Cassius Clay eating ice cream and drinking milk after the fight and celebrating. So just a little bit of history, just a little bit of something to add context to that movie. So if you saw it and you see that part where Cassius Clay is eating the ice cream out the refrigerator, that really happened because Malcolm documented it as happening. So we'll just take a quick break. If there's any questions, feel free to unmute your mic and ask that question, and we'll try to address it. We do have a few more things we want to get through on the agenda, but we do want to pause for a moment and get some engagement. So anybody have any questions they want to ask?
We have a few in the chat first I'd like to address.
Okay.
All right, most recently here, how do you feel about the DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that have suddenly cropped up in the wake of the George Floyd tragedy? Do you feel like they are genuine? And how do we make sure they last and have the effects we need?
I can address that. I don't know if Mr. Brooks wants to address it. I know you've had a lot more experience in this field. You've seen it year and year and year after year since the 80s and 90s and 2000s. These are not new initiatives. So I know Mr. Brooks has seen these initiatives before, but do you want to address that, Mr. Brooks?
I knew that question would come up. I knew it would come up. I'm gonna make it as succinct and short as I can. Those initiatives, as Leo said, we've been through this before, all suffer, in my estimation, a fatal flaw. And that is that, and certainly in the wake of George, the torture murder of George Floyd, racism has been relegated and reduced to a matter or question of personal prejudice. There's several books out now. I mean, it's great that there's this new wave of particularly Caucasians interested in racism. Am I racist? Am I behaving racistly and so forth? And unfortunately, as we have found out in the past, I mean, remember affirmative action, remember diversity. See, I can almost timeline when the language and the nomenclature change, but the issues never change. The language of how we address them change, but fundamentally the issues never change. And I've got some interesting pieces. Maybe a little bit later I can read a quotation that I got from a Caucasian blogger who gave one of the best definitions of racism. Personally, I've read, including many African Americans and so forth. So that's my issue with that. We've been here before. Nothing really was resolved, and today this widespread emphasis on challenging and firing people. And I mean, when people say and do really racist stuff, I mean, I'm not crying for them if they get fired from their job and all that, but I'm also aware that is segued into, well, let's go back and take books that were written 100 years ago and either ban them or take the N-word out of them. And, and it's like, that is not what this is about. And I'm quite sure Malcolm X would be saying, that's not the point here.
Right.
We're dealing with something far more fundamental than just whether or not you personally have offended somebody Black or are saying the wrong thing. No, we have an endemic, ossified system, calcified system of white supremacy in this country that is not going to go away just because a lot of people, and it also allows people to feel, oh, you know what? I took that anti-racism course, Leo, and I got an A, I'm not racist. Well, we can't go there either. Nobody's off the hook because they haven't offended a Black person lately. Nobody's off the hook. We're all trapped in a system. That's what Malcolm was trying to teach us. It's going to take more than that. Anyways, go ahead, Lee.
Mr. Brooks, that was actually my question. And what I wanted to say here is, I mean, it's tough to capture it all in the writing in the chat. But what I want to say here is that, I work in the corporate world. I'm sure a ton of other people here do too. There are a lot of people out there who are genuine in their want for change, and not, no single person here is going to, change the world with what they do. But, what are the things that I can do to really capture this moment and make sure that we, make that incremental change? Because, throughout your life, I mean, you're my parents' age, obviously, and they're, and, you guys have seen a ton more things, but at each one of these things, we've seen incremental change. How do we amplify that incremental change to make sure that we're taking the fullest advantage of this moment in history?
Booker T. Washington, he was advising Black people, but it's an advisory that I would give you and Caucasians who really do want to push this dial. Cast your buckets where you lay. Okay, first of all, number one, you have to take the time to really go back and look at the history of the African American people, since we're talking about this within reference to Black people. Yes, there's racism against Asians, there's racism against Latinos and Native Americans, and I'm not denying any of that. But one of the things that we're dealing with in America is, bottom line, they're not shooting everybody in the street. The police aren't killing everybody in the street. They're killing Black people. So racism for us is really, and maybe more properly referred to as anti-Blackness. And it's not to deny that there aren't other ethnic groups in America who are suffering from racism. But we're looking at a situation for Black people. We're looking at wherever you work in your corporate position. I just read an article 2 days ago, it was in the New York Times, about how many people have graduated from medical school. They graduated from medical school, and 4 or 5 years down the line, they still can't practice medicine because the resident system, the match system, where you come out of medical school and you get matched for a residency, tons of Black graduates and individuals who are immigrants. So they were a doctor in Pakistan, and now they've come to America and they can't get licensed and things like this. It's like, these are the little things that we need people just where they work. Take on human resources. Take on where you work, and not just cleanse yourself, if I can use that term, of, I mean, all of us are human and fallible. I'm quite sure that there's some people out there that, they curse when they remember my name because my humanness at that time did something offensive to them. But this effort, I'm not denying there are well-meaning whites. I'm not denying that at all. But I am saying the situation, as I'm saying in my book, is getting increasingly dangerous and lethal for Black people, in particular, in this country. And it's gonna take more than just, I'm not actively, trying to do something of a racist nature to other Black people. We're gonna need more than that. And it's not gonna be clear how much more we're gonna need unless people avail of themselves to really go back and look at the data. That's all we talk about in America now, is data. Well, the data on what has happened to Black people is out there. And I think that the more Caucasians in particular who really review the data, they're gonna go, no, we're gonna need to do more than just not be personally racist. We're gonna have to be willing to make some greater sacrifices in terms of the power equation and everything else. And, the verdict is still out on that. It really is. So.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. So what we'll do is I want to use a couple of Malcolm quotes to just show you what Malcolm thought about that towards the end of his life. These are not quotes that were taken from 50s when he was with the Nation of Islam. It wasn't about a time where he was taught that white people were the devil, because he abandoned that thought after he took his trip to Mecca and understood that it was really about good or bad human beings. But he also went to Africa and learned about the system of capitalism and how without racism, you cannot have the type of structure that we have in this society, that racism is an integral part of this society. And I would say to diversity and inclusion that, yeah, hires a lot of Black people. A lot of Black people are getting jobs, do these training classes and things like that. But at the end of the day, we're still doing the classes. And so one of the things that Malcolm said when somebody asked him, could they join the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which was exclusive for Black people, they asked him, can they join it? And part of his response was, where the really sincere white people have got to do their proving of themselves is not among Black victims, but out on the battle lines of where American racism really is, and that is in their own home communities. America's racism is among their own fellow whites. That's where the sincere whites who
Mhm.
really mean to accomplish something have
Yeah.
got to work. Now, another quote of Malcolm's, which I put in the chat, was racism is like a Cadillac. They come out with a new model every year. So this is why we have to do diversity and inclusion initiatives, because there are children right now who are going to be taught the 1619 curriculum, who are going to be taught how white people conquered, pillaged, killed, and murdered Black people. And that's going to affect the self-esteem of young Black children, while telling white children that it's acceptable for them to colonialize wherever they go. And the educational system is going to do that. And we're going to continue to keep spouting out statistics about how Blacks are suffering, but we're not going to talk about Black marriages that are lasting over a decade. We're not going to talk about Blacks who are doing all of the surviving, Blacks who are making a wealth of income, Blacks who are going into entrepreneurship. We're not going to talk about those things. And so what's going to happen is that we're going to continue to oppress the concept of Blackness through the ideologies of the Black suffrage. And because of the Black suffrage, Black people continue to be victimized, which is what we talked about earlier with Wilfred's quote, is that it hurts the self-esteem of Black people, which means it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle that people are unconsciously participating in. So when we say, oh man, there's a problem in the Black community, let's go attack it. But what about the successes of the Black community? Let's empower it. Let's highlight it. Let's put it on a pedestal, and let's not tear it down. When Blacks had the 300 towns all across this nation that were very successful and thriving economically on their own, independent of white infrastructure, they were burned down to the ground. The famous example is Greenwood, Oklahoma, which we talk about a lot, Tulsa, Oklahoma, but there were so many other towns. But that story is not being told in the textbooks of history. You didn't learn about that in your social studies class or your American history class. They don't teach that or highlight that, because the goal is not to highlight that type of information, because that will give esteem to the Black children. Meanwhile, we also don't talk about the $20,000 that were given to the Japanese after their internment here in America. So after Japanese internment, there was $20,000 given to every Japanese person. Blacks have not received a check yet. We're still fighting for the same stimulus everybody else fighting for. So I think Malcolm himself would have talked about diversity and inclusion in the same way that we're talking about it today, which means it hasn't really moved the dial forward. The advancements that we're seeing are concessions more so than anything, and they're not really pushing the needle. Black children are being disproportionately suspended from schools at an alarming rate, more so than they were before. The prisons are overcrowded. I see Paul Feldman is on this call, and he's been protesting about the prisons being overcrowded. We're over capacity in Nebraska alone. And we're talking about Black people making up 80% of the prison population. We're still talking about mass incarceration to this day. Black people were locked up for policy. For those who don't know what policy is the numbers game that Malcolm used to play back in the day. So a person would go and they would say, I want number 345, or I want my daughter's birthday. And that would go to a bookie who would put it in the machine, and then he'd pull a number every week, and then they'd hand out some money to some people. Today, that's called the lottery. So how Black people were surviving in urban areas that were very racist, where they would do policy in order to have an economic system. But that policy was made illegal. Blacks were locked up for it, and then it was legalized after the Blacks were locked up. So this is the same thing that happened with marijuana. Marijuana, it has been made illegal. Blacks, according to Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, are disproportionately incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses like marijuana. But meanwhile, all across the states, marijuana is being legalized. So after all the Blacks are being locked up, we'll legalize the thing that they were doing. In the 70s, you remember the blaxploitation films, the Mac, pimps, and all of that stuff. There were a lot of pimps running around. Meanwhile, you can go to Nevada today and see legalized prostitution, and nobody's stopping those institutions that are not Black-led, that are doing sex work, which is supposedly legal now in certain states. So these things that Blacks were doing in urban racist environments, trying to survive, that was typically under the radar, was illegal for a period of time to allow Blacks to suffer under penalty of law, and then legalize later to keep Blacks in a lower class position. So Malcolm himself would have spoke about all of these things today, because these are the same things he was talking about then. I live near Cash Savers, which is called Fields Foodway in North Omaha. Now, if you ever go into Cash Savers, they run this sweet little game on the people, where if you go in the store, they say our prices are extremely low and we will add 10% to your total when you get to the register, when you go to buy your groceries. So they pretend that their prices are lower than everybody's. Then when you get to the register, they add 10% plus the tax, or not the tax, there's no tax on grocery, but they add the 10% at the register, saying that this is going to save you money because it's a general 10% across the board added to your grocery total. So it's a slick way of saying we're going to charge you more for groceries. Meanwhile, those very same groceries, if you go out to West Omaha, even you can go to some place like Whole Foods, buy the same exact loaf of bread and get it cheaper than you could at Cash Savers. And the excuse for it will be because of theft, or because they're losing money because they didn't get shipments in like other places do, or they can't buy as much. That is insane. And Malcolm himself said this in one of his speeches a long time ago, that if you're in the poor communities or you're a Black person, you pay more for your grocery, you pay more, you pay more for your existence. But this is Malcolm talking in 1964, and it is 2021, and we're still having this conversation. So when we talk about things like progress and things like that, we're very far away from progress as it really needs to be.
Can,
So
can I just add something there? Add something about the marijuana legalization issue.
Yeah, feel free.
Now, of course, hundreds of thousands of African Americans have been sent to prison for possession and distribution of marijuana. And the idea, pushing the legalization is, well, we can stop arresting Blacks if marijuana is legal. And yeah, that's true. I mean, in a marijuana legal state, well, at least nobody Black is going to be going to prison anymore. But here's the thing, that even in what is obviously a good thing to happen, I mean, whether you like or use it or not, that's a good thing, because so many African Americans were arrested and put away for that, as opposed to Caucasians. But then you look at, so somebody would say, well, hey, we got marijuana legalized, so, we're moving forward. And I'm like, no, you can't move forward, because everybody you put in prison is going to come out with a felony conviction, which means I went to prison for selling marijuana, but now that marijuana is legal, I can't sell it. Think about that. Because I can't work in a dispensary with a felony conviction. When marijuana was legalized in Chicago, the Black community, or legalized in Illinois, unsuccessfully, the Black community was pushing for two things. One, if you're going to make it legal, then you immediately wipe out all of the convictions for marijuana of everybody in that state. That has not been done. And number two, they said, if marijuana was sold on the street, and now that it's legal, it can only be sold from a brick and mortar location. Why not pass a law, the same law that allows me to run a little push cart and sell hot dogs on the street if I get my vendor's license and sanitation clearance and all of that? Why not make it legal for people to get a distribution license so that they can then go back on the street and sell legal marijuana? This is what I mean when I talk about institutionalization, that yeah, a breakthrough was made, but one that by and large does not remotely clean up the damage that's been done to all of the people who were participating in that distribution and now are ruined for life, and marijuana is raining down from the clouds. That's the kind of thing that when we talk about trying to push back against racism, we have to be strong enough, all of us, to say, well, if you're going to legalize it, clean it up for all those who have suffered from its illegality, then we can make it even. And to quote Malcolm X, and you'll hear this many times from me, Malcolm X famously said, if you stick a knife 9 inches in my back, and then you come later and pull the knife out 3 inches, You haven't done anything for me. I still have 6 inches of blade in my back. You haven't corrected the situation until the knife has been completely removed and I have been provided with everything that I need to properly heal and get on with the rest of my life. And that has a lot to do with a lot of the things that are happening. The knife is still in the back of the African-American people, and we feel it and we know it. So go ahead.
I have a question for you, either one of you. In 1991, I believe it was, we had probably the largest gathering of people from across the country to honor and celebrate Malcolm X. And there was an event on Evans where there was a historical marker that someone had painted a swastika on the morning that we gathered there. And I wondered whatever happened to that. I took photos of it, but I just wondered, did anybody ever have that or restore it or what?
Yeah, that is a great question, Ms. Pope. So let me tell you what happened to that that particular sign. So shortly after that, whenever that event was, the sign was knocked down and ran over. It was knocked down and ran over with tire tracks on it. And it disappeared. Nobody in the organization actually knew what happened to that sign. It disappeared. Nobody knew where it was. And then the new historical marker got put up, the metal sign.
Okay.
In 2018, the summer of 2018, a guy came to the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation with that original sign on the top of his truck, tire marks still on it from the time it got ran over. Brought it back to the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation and dropped it off and said, hey, I found this on the ground some years ago. I saved it in my garage. I didn't know where the organization met. I didn't know where the people were. So I just kept it until I could figure out where to take it. The organization didn't have a building in 1991, so he kept it until he discovered that the organization had purchased the Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall and brought it back to Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Hall. So today, that very sign is sitting in the lobby area of the Malcolm X Foundation, dirt marks still on it as a display, and we even found the picture of the swastika painted on it too.
Leo, I'm here. I can show the sign.
Yeah, do that. That's Audrey, who is our tour guide. She's at the Malcolm X Center right now.
And I have a lot of
There's
those.
the sign. Is that the sign you're talking about?
No, that doesn't look like it, but maybe it is. I have photos that I am going to donate to you all from that event, including Malcolm's relatives and including Dr. Shabazz. So I will do that. So if that, boy, that doesn't look, because it, well, whatever.
Yeah, I think that's the sign. We got a picture.
Wonder where the swastika, the red paint from the swastika is.
It was cleaned off.
Oh, okay.
It was originally cleaned off.
Okay.
And actually, I can hold on just a second. I can show it to you here in just a minute. So you see that there? That's what you're talking about.
Oh, wow, look at that.
Yep, there's the original sign with that's the same exact sign that she showed you.
It was
Yeah.
to see that because the paint was still dripping from it when
Wow.
it arrived up there. It was stunning that they would do that.
Yep. So yeah, we can get, let me make sure I'm clear on my point that I made earlier as far as racism is concerned and the diversity and inclusion. The point of my particular rhetoric is simply to say that racism cannot change until we literally change how we do things in the system. And the system has not changed. We still educate children the same way. We still go into the corporate field the same way. We still engage economically the same way. And because of that, that's why we're running into the problems. And then when we do things like integration, or we do things like, instead of giving Blacks their autonomy, we try to force them to work with others. So we say Black and Brown and everybody else. Blacks never actually get their full share alone as an entity or as a group, which is why Malcolm created the Organization of Afro-American Unity to distinguish Blacks as a specific and separate ethnic group so that whatever funds are allocated, whatever federal regulations are passed, whatever institutions are being built can be specific. Because if you are a white person or a person that considers yourself white, you know you can always abandon the idea of whiteness and go back to whatever ethnicity you choose to go back to, whether that be Norwegian, Polish, German, French, Italian, whatever. But blacks are going to be black because our history has been burned up and erased. So when you call it Afro-Americans, when you say Afro-American, then you're really giving blacks an identity. And so Malcolm wanted, as I said earlier, for individuals who are white to spend more time around whites, teaching whites how to interact and how to be anti-racist, which is why the Malcolm X Memorial Foundation, in line with Malcolm's values and belief, held the White Allies training specifically, because we understood that Malcolm would have wanted that done and not for just an influx of whites to join the organization and volunteer and do all these things. But we knew that racism has to be dealt with individuals who have the power to continue to inflict racism on others. And so the individuals that are doing that work are doing a phenomenal job. And we're carrying the torch that Malcolm left for us in the way that Malcolm would have wanted it. And it's not necessarily diversity and inclusion. It's specifically saying, hey, this is where we need to get the white population to understand and need to get them to, and we need other whites to help us do that. And so go do that work. So for those who do the training, thank you if you're on this call. And that's the line that we're on.
Hey, I had a question real quick. Peace, everybody. Shout out to Brother Leo, Brother Walter Brooks for doing this. Really enjoying the conversation. And I think Brother Walter Brooks sort of mentioned it, and you also alluded to it, Leo, as far as the human rights movement that we're in right now, and kind of understanding, as you said, carrying on, picking up where Brother Malcolm left off, and really understanding that, you know, the movement before us was the civil rights movement, but the next step in the conversation is the human rights movement. And I don't know if y'all plan on touching on it, but can you talk about the actual case that Malcolm was going to bring under that paradigm of the human rights movement to the United Nations, and taking it kind of above the United States?
Well, one of the things, when Malcolm came back from Africa, that was a great motivator for him to, re-envision the African-American struggle as being a part of the global struggle for human rights for all of humanity. Was he had a commitment from 20 different nations that were members of the United Nations. They said, if you go back to America and you can create an organization that clearly, to the membership of the United Nations, is speaking not simply for the African-American people, but an organization that is accessible to all Americans to play a part in this struggle. So it's not just Black people saying the United Nations needs to look at the United States government and its social system to really assess the treatment of the African-American people, but many, many Americans, the more the merrier. But Malcolm had that guarantee, which is a lot, because if he had been able to come back, if he'd been able to follow through on the OAAU, which has a foundational plank. In fact, give me a second here. It says in his speech, when he introduced the OAAU, he said, "We are resolved to reinforce the common bond and purpose between our people by submerging all of our differences and establishing a non-sectarian constructed program for human rights. We are persuaded that the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Constitution of the United States, and the Bill of Rights are the principles in which we believe, and that these documents, if put into practice, represent the essence of mankind's hope and good intentions. The OAAU will work with every leader and other organization in this country interested in a program designed to bring your and my problem before the United Nations. We feel that the problem of the Black man, Black people in America is beyond the ability of the American government to solve it. We want to go before the United Nations and indict the United States government for the continued criminal injustices that our people experience in this country. That is a major, major league platform that he was denied the opportunity to really bring to life. I will say there is a movement that is supposed to this year culminate in a convention in New York City. I believe it's next November, where it is pretty much what Malcolm had envisioned. It is a consortium of Native Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, who are going to form the ground, the underpinning for a convention that will culminate in a document that is going to be presented to the United Nations, indicting the United States government for genocidal practices against the various ethnic groups in this country. That is, I have communicated with some people that are very much involved with that. I know Dr. Tekla Johnson, who wrote the autobiography, or who wrote Ernie Chambers, Senator Ernie Chambers' biography. She's playing a major role in this, and I've actually shared some of my research into my book on the genocide of the African American people with them, and I've been told that some excerpts from my work is going to be a part of this document. It's not the first time. In 1951, we charged genocide, the crimes against the Negro people in the United States. That was presented to representatives of the United Nations in 1951. So here we are in 2021, 60 years later, and 70 years later, and we're still trying to get some traction on that. And just as an aside, in 1951, the document was attempted to be presented to Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, was the American ambassador to the United Nations in 1951. She refused to receive it. She didn't take their phone calls. So Paul Robeson and the other individual, I just had a senior moment, that co-wrote it, they had to go to Geneva themselves. That's where the United Nations was headquartered before they built the new headquarters in New York City. And they went to Geneva, Switzerland, and presented the document to some administrative representatives of the United Nations. But Eleanor Roosevelt was not going to accept that as the United States government representative to the United Nations, because then she would have had to present it for discussion. And she refused to do that, even though, again, she helped the Tuskegee Airmen. When she flew in an airplane with the Tuskegee Airmen, that basically shut down, the continued disbelief that Black people could fly airplanes, combat airplanes, and so forth. So there was a lot of good about it. But she refused to take a 250-page document indicting the US government for genocide against the African American people. She didn't touch it. So that's what we've been dealing with. Even the best can still reach that one point where, nope, can't do this. So anyways, hope that kind of answered your question.
Yes, sir. And I would just simply add to that. It's not much to follow up with. Walter did a great job making that clear. I just want to point out a little bit about that, which is when you're considered a Black person in America, you fall under civil rights because Black is a racial construct, a social construct. And so, in essence, when a Black person travels to London or France or out of this country, we're considered Americans. So, if an American hurts another American, the United Nations doesn't see a problem with Americans hurting Americans. Now, if Americans hurt an Italian, however, or Americans picked on an indigenous population, then the United Nations would hear their case because those individuals can always go back to their sovereign nation and get support. Well, Blacks don't have a sovereign nation to get support. We don't have a body politic of people that we can go back to that we come from. We can't say, oh, we're from the Black nation over here, which is why Black nationalism is so important and why Malcolm and Martin Luther King had to shift from civil rights to human rights, because the understanding of human rights is the reason why they even created the Geneva Convention in the first place on human rights, because of the assassination of all the Jewish people in the Holocaust. And they said, we will never have that again. So if people are being genocided, we want to make sure that we hear their case and we can actually bring charges against those people. Or Malcolm understood that if we didn't get identified as a group, as an ethnic group first, then there's no way that we could actually petition properly. So he started taking the proper steps, which is form the organization, gain membership, identify the members of that organization as human beings. So at the end of every speech, he would say, we declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being on this earth, in this society, on this day in which we choose to bring into existence by any means necessary. That's where that quote actually comes from, is he had to declare people as human beings, especially Black people, so that when he went to the United Nations, that the petition could actually be heard legitimately and take it out of civil rights.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we got about 7 more minutes left.
Thank you.
And we'll be wrapping up. Are there any other questions?
Walter, there was one question from Facebook, just if you could share a general timeline of your book and where we can find it, or when. I know that you're in progress, but people are asking.
Yeah. Every time I say, hey, I'm a month away, I'm 6 months out. But right now, I got my first proof book probably about almost 3.5 to 4 months ago. All of the master revisions I've received, actually, I just received them 4 days ago that I had sent in to my book designer. That's one of the things about doing a nonfiction book is once my book is in the hands of a designer, then all the changes have to be made by the designer rather than me. So to make a long story short, I turned 74 March 22nd. I cannot believe my book will not be available to the public by then. I've already had conversations with the Afro-American Bookstore of Omaha, Nebraska. That bookstore is still in business online. And Annette Taylor will be my first bookseller, and she will be selling my book online. So
Also, we are sharing the screen right now of your book cover, so the people on Zoom and hopefully Facebook can see. But
if people can make out the cover, it's a picture of the Kerner Commission in 1968 that came forth with their monumental report that said America was moving into two sides, two peoples, one oppressed, one not. And there's another line, a second line on the book cover that reads, racism has formed the fundamental history of America has been racist, and racism now threatens to determine our future. That's why I put that on the cover. That's what I'm saying. These people called it in 1968. We didn't get the job done in the last 50 some years. And now we're moving into uncharted waters with a significant portion of the American people, 75 million at least, Trumpites, who basically have established they're ready to go to war. Yeah, that's where we're at now. So give me another month and you'll be able to contact the Afro-American Bookstore online and order copies online, hopefully by the end of March.
All right. Are there any other questions before we close out? It is 5:56 according to my time. All right, so we thank you all for joining us. Just to give a little bit more context for Malcolm, for some questions we didn't get to, we didn't talk about. People often ask, how long was Malcolm incarcerated? It was approximately 8 years. And Malcolm also believed that individuals who were humans post his trip to Mecca can marry anybody that they wanted. And so he didn't have an issue with interracial marriage. I know that's something that people tend to think that Malcolm would have been opposed to interracial marriage, but actually Malcolm had come to an understanding that individuals can marry who they want, but they can't forget who they are. And that was pretty much his philosophy. Malcolm's political views was Malcolm very much favored socialism, but he was a Black nationalist. And Black nationalism and socialism is not the exact same thing. Black nationalism is specific about getting Black people identified as a nation of people and forming a republic within themselves. And this was done in Liberia historically, where Blacks in the abolitionist movement actually moved to Liberia and founded their own colony and started their own state. So Liberia was the original place where that took place.
And can I recommend, Leo, that everybody that is participating in this, just Google Malcolm X introduces the OAAU, Organization of African American Unity. I printed it out, and even if the lettering was a little bit bigger, it was like 50 pages. Malcolm took probably 2 hours in a speech. That had to have been at least a 2-hour speech where he went into details, politics, economics, culture, social situations, self-defense.
Yep.
Not really talk about self-defense. You need to see what he had to say about that. This was his final will. I call it his final will and testament, not just to Black people, but to the American people. That the American people take heed. And we're seeing now, as I've been saying repeatedly throughout this conversation, we're in some really dangerous times in this country. The smell of civil war is in the air. And it's not hyperbole. No, it's real. It's real. And Malcolm had a plan for that too.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Leo. And all of you that joined us.
Thank you, Mr. Brooks. I will not follow that up. You all have a great evening and make sure you check us out for our next event.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Goodbye.